Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of The Joy Painting with Bob Ross. Today I thought we'd paint a nice little ethical argument about a wage with gravity. We're going to be answering the question, should all businesses be required to reduce the gap between CEO's pay and the average salary of workers? My answer is going to be yes. In order to prove this claim, I'm going to use consequentialism, Kantian ethics, contractarianism, and virtue ethics. At the end, I'll have a small rebuttal to any arguments with egoism. So to have a little background information on the case, in 2008, there's, of course, the Great Recession, and the CEO of Gravity Payments was really unhappy with how the company was going and how his quality of life for his workers was going. Some of the workers accused him of paying them starvation wages, and their quality of life was bad because of it. He was very shocked, and he decided to increase their wages from $35,000 a year to $48,000 a year. And the company's profits went up, and the productivity went from 30 to 40%. The CEO of Gravity Payments was still kind of unhappy with the quality of life of his workers, so he increased wages from $48,000 a year to $70,000 a year over the course of a few years. And the CEO's own brother, along with the executives, decided to sue the CEO for excessive CEO compensation and reducing the value of the company, whatever. So with my arguments, I'm going to support my claim that all businesses should be required to reduce the gap between CEO pay and worker pay. Alright, so to start off this one, we're going to get a little consequentialism on our brush. And we'll get to painting our first argument. And remember, there's no such thing as an invalid argument, just happy little accidents. Premise 1 says acts are morally right because they maximize the overall goodness in the world. Premise 2 says minimizing the gap between workers and CEOs will maximize the total amount of goodness in the world. Therefore, it is morally right to minimize the gap between CEOs and workers. So, premise 1 is true according to consequentialism. Premise 2 you can disagree with, but I'm going to tell you why you shouldn't. So the CEO's quality of life doesn't drastically decrease, which would minimize the total amount of goodness. They go from being rich to less rich. And I don't feel bad for a CEO earning $200,000 a year instead of $2 million a year. I don't think anyone's going to say that the CEO's happiness would actually maximize overall happiness because it's just one person or a few people with the executives. The workers vastly outnumber the CEO, so their quality of life going from $35,000 a year to $70,000 a year will drastically improve. Because money doesn't necessarily make you happy, but being financially stable does. And according to a study done in 2018, 46.5% of Americans earn $30,000 a year or less. This is a starvation wage, and it doesn't allow you to be financially stable, so therefore you can't really buy a house, have kids, and if you do, you're kind of living paycheck to paycheck, and life is not going to be as good as it could be if you were earning $70,000 a year. And some might say a CEO earning more allows them to put more money back into the company, but we can see with Gravity Payments, productivity and company profits increased when workers were given more than just a starvation wage, even at the cost to the executives. Alright, I think the painting is going pretty well, so next we're going to get some Kantian ethics on your brush, and we'll start with our argument. Premise 1 says that an act is morally right because its maxim is universalizable. Premise 2 says minimizing the gap between average salary of workers and CEOs is acting upon a maxim that is universalizable. Therefore, minimizing the gap between CEOs and workers is morally acceptable. A maxim is the principle of action for doing something, and universalizability is if everyone would agree to it. Premise 1, according to Kantian ethics, is true, but premise 2 you could disagree with, and again I'll tell you why you shouldn't. My argument for this is that this maxim is universalizable because the maxim would be agreed to by most of everyone, and the people who didn't would be acting upon a maxim that isn't universalizable. And what I mean by that is that CEOs wouldn't like it if they were earning a starvation wage, but they're okay with other people because they are making an exception for themselves, which is not universalizing your maxim. Some critics might say that acting upon a maxim that isn't universalizable would have disastrous consequences, and that everyone agrees to the current system and there's no disasters, so we're fine. So I would say that the implications of this are pretty disastrous because almost half of Americans are earning starvation wages. They are not able to be financially stable, and this is all happening because CEOs are acting upon a maxim that isn't universalizable. A lot of people don't really get to protest this because they can't. Their only source of income is this job, and if they protest it, they're probably going to be fired because there are a lot of other people who would want that job. So they don't speak out against it because they can't. My argument is that a universal maxim would be one that reduces the gap because you wouldn't like it if you had to work for a starvation wage, so you're going to not agree with a maxim that allows for that. You would agree with one that reduces the gap. Alright, for my next argument, I'm going to use virtue ethics. So, premise 1 is going to say that an act is morally right if a virtuous person acting in character would do that action. Premise 2 says that a virtuous person would want to minimize the gap between workers and CEOs. Therefore, it is morally right to minimize the gap between the pay of the CEOs and the average salary of workers. Again, premise 1 is true according to virtue ethics. Premise 2 is where you could disagree, but I'm going to tell you again why you shouldn't. So it's hard to say exactly what a virtuous person is, but it is kind of easier to say what a virtuous person isn't for sure. And a virtuous person would not be greedy. That's pretty bad. I think we all agree that greed is a bad trait to have. You don't want to be a greedy person. Greed is defined as an intense and selfish desire for things like wealth or power or whatever. And I'm not saying that CEOs are greedy because they want more money. I'm saying they're greedy because they want more money at the expense of workers. When the pay of CEOs is 278 to 1 on average, they're actually exploiting their workers, and that's not okay. It's very greedy. And a virtuous person would be somewhere in between extremely charitable and greedy. And a virtuous person would be in the middle, and I don't think a CEO is there. I think they're more over here. I would say a virtuous worker would be compassionate and would want to help their fellow workers, and they would want them to have better lives as well. So they would also advocate for minimizing the gap. So next we're going to move on to contractarianism, or social contract theory, and we're going to say that acts are morally right if permitted by rules that free, equal, rational people would agree to if others obey the rules as well. Premise 2 says that free, equal, and rational people would agree to minimizing the gap between CEOs and workers. Therefore, it is morally right to decrease the gap between CEO pay and worker pay. So just like before, premise 1 is true according to contractarianism. Premise 2 hinges on if free, equal, and rational people would agree to this, and also very important, if people are free, equal, and rational. Some might say that people agree to the current rules because they don't explicitly say that they disagree, and they still participate in the system. But people aren't always free, equal, and rational. So obviously Jeff Bezos or Jeff Bezos' son wouldn't agree to these rules because he's born into immense wealth and he would want to keep that wealth. But someone who's born into a poorer family would accept these rules because they don't want to work on a starvation wage so someone else can get richer. And since people are born into different amounts of wealth, there's huge wealth inequality in America, so people aren't equal when they agree to these rules. Further, I would say that a lot of people aren't free because they're kind of stuck having to work on starvation wages just so they can support their family. And they're not really free because they're stuck doing that and they don't really have a choice. They can't just up and leave their job because they have to put food on the table for their kids. And the big counter argument to this would be that people would want the system because they would want their chance to be able to be super rich at the very top. But I don't think any rational person would do that because only CEOs are at the 0.001% or whatever. I'll have the statistic up here. But it's far more likely that you'll be in the bottom half of America that didn't make it and is now earning $30,000 a year less or just not a very good wage. I would say that no free, equal, and rational people would ever take their chances and have such a bad consequence of earning a starvation wage. And the people that would agree to the system are people who are already very rich and they don't want to lose their wealth and they don't want to give up any to people at the bottom. So this brings up an interesting question. If you take away someone's wealth, are you changing them as a person? I would argue no, you are not. Money doesn't make you more compassionate or intelligent or moral. It just makes you have more money, and it doesn't change you as a person. So therefore, if we take it away, we aren't taking away your compassion or your morality or your intelligence. We're just taking away the circumstance that you're in currently. So now, if you take away someone's wealth, if you take away a CEO's wealth, you're not changing them as a person, but now they don't want to agree to the old rules. They would want to earn more than $30,000 a year because it's just very irrational to be okay with earning a starvation wage so other people can get rich. So you might notice we need a happy little tree. So we're going to put in a happy ethical egoism tree. So the argument is that people in ethical egoism would want to maximize their own self-interest, and becoming very rich is obviously promoting their own self-interest. Because of that, they wouldn't want to get rid of the current system where CEO pay would be weakened for someone else because they don't care about other people. So premise 1 is true according to ethical egoism, and I would agree with premise 3 that minimizing the gap between CEOs and workers actually weakens this current system, and I like that. That's what I want. And I would disagree with premise 2, not because I don't think people want to be rich. I do think people want to be rich, but I think it's irrational to be okay with the system currently because it's so statistically unlikely that you'll become super rich, and it's more likely that you'll become a part of the machine that makes other people rich. So I would say that people actually don't want a system that would allow for that because it would maximize their own self-interest if their wages went from $35,000 a year to $70,000 a year, because it's far more likely that that's going to be their wage rather than $6 million or whatever. And if the ethical egoist was earning $30,000 or $35,000 a year, it would actually promote their self-interest to advocate for this because they would go from $35,000 a year to $70,000 a year, and they'd be financially stable that way. But we're talking about companies running, and I don't think a company can run based off of pure ethical egoism because, of course, the people at the top would try to squeeze as much money out of the people at the bottom. And inevitably, as history has shown us, this would lead to the people at the bottom getting mad at the people at the top and overthrowing them. In more peaceful situations, people will form unions and make demands for the company, go on strikes to fight against them. And history has also shown us that CEOs are not generally liked in a communist revolution or a socialist revolution. And I'm sure that a CEO doesn't want to have to fight a union, much less a violent socialist or communist uprising, which history has shown us has happened because workers get fed up. And of course, the CEOs are benefiting quite a bit because it's maximizing their own self-interest, but that can only happen for so long. Because as we see in 1965, it went from CEO to worker pay 20 to 1. Now we have 278 to 1, or whatever, 221 if you want to use the conservative estimate. People are not okay with that. Almost half of Americans earning starving wages are getting very fed up with it. And you can see that people are getting fed up with it with politicians like AOC, Bernie Sanders, and Elizabeth Warren growing in popularity in the US, especially among young people. So if a CEO wanted to maximize their own self-interest, they wouldn't want to exploit their workers too much because that could lead to unions or, in worse scenarios, bad stuff. So I get it, okay? Yeah, I am a little biased. I mean, I work for 10 cents more than minimum wage because I work at a coffee shop, but according to consequentialism, Kantian ethics, social contract theory or contractarianism, and virtue ethics, there should be a requirement to minimize the gap between CEOs and workers. And also, ethical egoism doesn't provide a strong enough argument for there not to be a requirement. So, and with that, I think we made a good painting today.